Guess who's back with another video, and so soon? I spoil you guys, I know. And today we're talking about one of my favorite shonens, Kenichi The Mightiest Disciple. And one thing that has always perplexed me about Kenichi as a series is its simultaneous broad appeal and yet lack of popularity. A lot of people know about this show, but I hardly ever see any discourse about it, which is strange to me as it is one of, if not the best shonens out there, talking exclusively about the 50 episode anime, of course, not the mangas, which will be another video in their own right, and not the 11 episode OVAs that came out in 2012, neither of which have ever been officially translated into English. No, I think the anime for Kenichi is a perfect shonen story from beginning to end. It has a tight plot and great memorable characters. Its themes of working hard and determination are well made and don't betray themselves, something that happens sometimes in other shows. And for an anime adaptation of a shonen from the mid 2000s, it isn't overly bloated or abhorrently paced and is pretty well animated. It fits everything it needs to into a tight 50 episode runtime that may even leave you wanting more. I know for me it certainly did, and that's why I actually did read the manga, which, like I said, I will be making a separate video about, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel to see when that comes out. Now, for those of you that haven't seen Kenichi and are wondering what's so special about it, the funny part here is that just like the main character Kenichi Shirahama himself, it isn't. He's just a completely average guy with no talent for just about anything, but when he decides he wants to be stronger, to stop being bullied, and with the help of his new friend Miu Furinji, he undertakes rigorous training that a normal person wouldn't be able to handle. And that's where you see Kenichi's true talent, in his determination. He never gives up. He has the willpower to overcome anything and everything he sets his mind to, which, okay, I get it, isn't the most revolutionary concept for a shonen protagonist, but where this differs from a lot of shonen is that's it. There isn't anything else about Kenichi. There aren't shortcuts he can take to get stronger. He just has to work not as hard, but even harder than everybody else to make up for his lack of talent, which is a great message to have in a show, especially when it's aimed at younger audiences. Watching this when I was younger really had an effect on me personally. It made me want to work harder and stop making excuses for things that I wanted to do in my life. And as a result, I really buckled down on playing guitar, which is something I'm really thankful for now. Now, he's not always graceful or cool about it, but when push comes to shove, Kenichi is someone who will always rise to the occasion, despite being more cowardly and pacifistic than most. That's why Kenichi is a compelling character. He's more human than your average shonen protagonist. He's not always willing to jump headfirst into a fight. He doesn't want to fight at all, really. What he really wants to do is be a writer and take care of flowers, an aspect of his character that just makes him so much more richer than a typical single-minded, goal-focused protagonist. But the best aspect of Kenichi to me is that despite the fact that he doesn't want to fight, he still wants to change and grow and will accept a challenge if it comes to him, which really puts him above other characters, like another character, say like Suna from Katsuko Hitman Reborn, who gets most of his change forced upon him. And he's only one of the rich characters I feel this series. Another standout being Nijima, Kenichi's friend, in big quotation marks here, who originally used to pick on him, but as Kenichi started to become stronger, he also changed the way that Nijima thought about him, and everything else really. He went from being an antagonistic force in Kenichi's life to being a pillar of support because he wanted to see how far Kenichi could go, initially having the view that people can never change in this world. But as Kenichi grew and changed and challenged that notion again and again, he changed not just Nijima, but all the people around him, converting several villains to his side by the end of the series, which is another thing I want to talk about that makes Kenichi so good to me, the villain progression in this series. Now, this is one thing that especially elevates the anime over the manga for me, as the anime only adapts the first arc of Kenichi, the Ragnarok arc, but the manga does continue after where the anime ends, which I felt was a perfect conclusion to the series. And while the manga had plenty of cool stuff after where the anime ends, it was clear that it was much less planned out, and looking at the anime as if it's the whole story, you get a neat little picture that fits perfectly in the frame. As having a gang be the main villain faction was a great idea, not just because it's unique, but because it has a hierarchy. You know that the person at the top is going to be the most powerful, and that only amplifies as you introduce more and more powerful lower level characters. And numbering the fist gives a nice sense of progression as they get taken down, and not taking them in order makes it more interesting than the smaller number is stronger until you get to 1. And with the emphasis being on them being martial artists constantly training, you never know when one might surpass the other. Add to that all the villains are unique and interesting with their own personalities and personal fighting styles, one of the most interesting to me being the fourth fist, Loki, someone who, despite being at a rather high position in the gang of fighters, is less of a fighter and more of a tactician and manipulator, which elevates him from being a less powerful fighter to one of the main threats of the gang. Another interesting villain is the eighth fist, Kisara, who brings up another point I want to make about Kenichi's characters, which is its great use of female characters. Seriously, in the era of the big three where Sakura and Orihime were the norm for female characters in a shonen. Kenichi is like a breath of fresh air, having female characters that are badass and interesting. Like Kisara, who we're introduced to early on as the leader of the gang of delinquents harassing Kenichi, which goes back into the villain progression as we see Kenichi get in fight after fight with more powerful people like Takeda and Ukida, who are the most powerful fighters we've seen up until that point, which really gives her a sense of intimidation without her even having to do anything. And when we do see her take action, she really shows what she's capable of, and especially when she leads the jump on Takeda for leaving Ragnarok, which really sets up the 8 deadly fists nicely. And it works really well as establishing the fist as a real threat. Now, Kisara herself has more to a character than that as well, having a love of cats that falls in line with the series' leading lady Miyu Furinji, as well as an interesting history with the third fist Freya. And this is just scratching the surface of the female characters, like Miyu, the female lead of the series, who I've hardly talked about so far. She's the major impetus behind Kenichi's growth, and not just for hormonal reasons. She's a book smart person, but ditzy. She is super strong from training with her grandfather throughout her childhood. So she's a person that stands out very much as tough, smart, kind, and attractive, which causes her problems in her life to the point where she even wears fake glasses at school to try and stand out less. And there are plenty of other good female characters throughout the show, like Kenichi's little sister Honoka is fun and has great interactions with Hermit later in the series, Renka, Kensei's daughter, who forms a love triangle with Kenichi and Miyu, and Freya, who doesn't get explored that much in the anime, but is still cool nonetheless. Also, one of Kenichi's masters, Shigure, and this also leads me into one of the best aspects of Kenichi, and one that separates it from a lot of shonen, the masters. The masters in Kenichi are such interesting and rich characters all on their own. They completely steal the show every time they are on screen, and every one of them individually would make for an amazing mentor in any shonen series. But this series manages to fit all 6 into one show and keep any one of them from outshining the others. They all have really interesting designs and are masters of their own unique styles. You have the aforementioned Shigure Kosaka, master of weapons, who, despite being quiet, reserved, and deadly, has a childlike innocence to her that stands in stark contrast to her typical demeanor. Speaking of which, next we have Apachai Hopachai, the death god of Muay Thai, who has a similar childlike innocence that betrays his epithet and insane power. These two, being pretty similar, get bounced off each other quite a bit and form a pretty comical duo. Next we have the Japanese Jujutsu master Akesame Koetsuji, who, in addition to being a master of Jujutsu, is also a master of, well, pretty much whatever the hell he decides to do. He's a master craftsman, a doctor, and an artist. You name it, and Akisame can do it. He's also a philosopher who is often the voice of reason Kenichi turns to for advice. Then we have Shio Sakaki, the brash 100th Dawn street fighter, a karate master who's even tougher than he looks, with a cold exterior, but once you get to know him, you'll find he's got a heart of gold. He goes from initially being completely against the idea of training Kenichi to being one of the masters most protective of him. Also, he opens beer bottles with a karate chop. Now, tell me that isn't dope. Next, we have Kensei Ma, the master of all things Chinese Kung Fu, who is more on the Master Roshi side of the mentor spectrum. And while being a pervert with a camera, he's also very wise. Usually the one to help Kenichi with his romantic issues as well as other things. And he has an interesting relationship to the Master of Hermit, being his brother, as well as Renka, who I mentioned before. Now, last but definitely not least is the elder of the dojo, the invincible Superman Hayato Furinji, who is also Miyu's grandfather. And while we don't get to see much of him throughout most of the series, whenever he shows up, he often gives Kenichi great advice or really illuminates things in a way that shows his many decades of experience. And towards the end of the series, we do get to see him a bit more when he takes Kenichi for special training in the mountains. And the masters in the series give a great sense of scale. They are the limit that everyone else is striving towards, and making them fun, enjoyable characters keeps the training that Kenichi does throughout the show from getting repetitive and boring, which adds another feather in the cap of the series. Is it's basically just one long training arc, which could be a detriment if you're not too into that, but if you are, it'll definitely elevate the series for you. As Kenichi never stops training, and every fight sees him learning and using new techniques or skills he acquires through his training, and having all the masters being masters of different styles, the creator has a lot of potential techniques to work with, not being limited to one style. Now, one flaw you could possibly see in the show is the fact that Kenichi is able to catch up to people that have been training for years in a matter of months. And while this is valid criticism, as I doubt that would be possible in the real world, the anime itself answers this by having Kenichi's training be way harsher than anybody else's, as well as the fact that he's learning all different styles of martial arts. This really gives him the edge against the people who are only studying one. In theory, at least. Once again, I doubt that would be the case in the real world, but the suspension of disbelief needed is hardly a big ask. Also, while initially grounded in more realistic martial arts, the show towards the back half starts to take a little swerve into more fantasy martial arts, which is a little jarring, but once again, it's an anime, and I feel these elements help heighten rather than detract from the enjoyment of the series. And one last criticism, as well as a quick spoiler warning. From here on out, there's going to be spoilers on the story of Kenichi, so if you haven't seen it yet and don't want to be spoiled, don't watch this yet. Make sure to go to watch the series. It's available for free on YouTube, by the way, on TMS's YouTube channel, so give it a watch if you haven't. I did say earlier that the plot was pretty tight, and for the most part it is, except for Kenichi's really convenient lapse of memory, where he forgets about the fight he had with Ryuto and meeting Miyu as a kid, which seems pretty convenient for a plot twist's sake, especially considering how memorable that kind of day would probably be. And he still felt sentimentality for the Yin Yang badge until modern day as well, but he didn't remember why. I feel like a daily reminder like that would prevent something like that, but not for Kenichi, I guess. And that's it for the criticisms I can really think of, which in the grand scheme of things is a pretty minor list of gripes. Now let's talk about the plot itself. So future CJ here, and I'm recording this after everything else because one thing I wanted to come back to mention was the soundtrack that I didn't talk about at all, but going back and listening to it, the soundtrack for Kenichi is really fucking good. It has a great mix of good sounding synths and electric pianos mixed with some cool drum machine rhythms, as well as switching between that and some more like heavy metal electric guitar, like virtuoso kind of stuff, as well as really good traditional Japanese instruments. Whether they're played on the real things or through synths, it still gives it a cool feeling. It reminds me of Naruto's soundtrack. Although not as good, obviously. This was probably inspired by Naruto's soundtrack, as well as the orchestral pieces in here are also top notch. So I highly recommend checking out the soundtrack if you haven't. It is definitely something that I remembered a lot better going back and listening to the songs individually. It gave me that feeling of I know exactly where this song is from. I know exactly what scene is happening when this song plays, and that is what a good soundtrack does. So Kenichi has a great one. The show starts off with the meeting between Kenichi and Miyu, and as I mentioned before, Kenichi starts training at Ryu Zanpaku at her recommendation in order to defeat a bully in the karate club who challenged him to a fight. And after Kenichi defeats the bully, a domino line of fighters begins for Kenichi, each one stronger than the last, wanting to beat him. And early on in Kenichi, what's great is he loses fights quite a bit, whether because he's not strong enough or he lacks experience or because he's simply afraid. He isn't just a golden boy, and each fight he loses helps him improve in areas he was lacking before and helps to elevate the other side characters like Miyu and Takeda. And despite the Masters being a seeming get out of jail free card, they make it a point not to intervene in his fights if they are around. Now as we get deeper into the show, the plot becomes less defeat the people coming after Kenichi all the time to a more personal focus from Ragnarok, starting with the Sixth Fist Hermit, who takes an interest in Kenichi and also turns out to be Natsu Tanimoto, the most popular boy at his school, a person who leads a double life of honor student by day and ruthless martial artist by night. He tries to steal Miyu away from Kenichi by befriending them, all the while ruining Kenichi's reputation from the shadows to try and prove that Kenichi is just pretending to be who he is, as he believes everyone is just playing a role to deceive each other, which is why he leads the double life he does. They end up fighting to a stalemate, which causes Hermit to seclude himself in training, during which Kenichi takes down the Fifth Fist, Siegfried, the first of the fists to fall. And I don't want to get too much into it here, but something I did want to mention about the Eight Fists is that they're all interesting villains with unique goals that align themselves with Ragnarok to further their own goals and not out of camaraderie, which makes them a very fun villain group for our heroes to fight against. But when Hermit returns, he accidentally endears Kenichi's little sister to him without knowing who she is. But when he finds out, so too does the Fourth Fist, Loki, and so Loki kidnaps her to force Kenichi into a fight, a plan that Hermit doesn't really want to go along with, but is forced to by Loki. And this is a great little arc in the show, spanning a few episodes. Kenichi rushing to save his sister as soon as he finds out is an awesome sequence, and his subsequent fight with Hermit is one of the best in the series, during which we get the backstory of Tanimoto, which is basically Kaiba's from Yu-Gi-Oh, but more tragic, as his adopted father was poisoned by his stepmother, and afterwards the company that was left to him was taken away. After that he was nearly killed, but was saved by a man known as the Great Sage Fist, only for his sickly sister he had been trying to save to pass away shortly thereafter. This, combined with the training that he received from Kensei's brother Sogetsu, leads him to being the person he is now, and by the end of the fight, Kenichi seemingly comes out the the victor, only for Loki to come out with Honoka still held hostage to pummel Kenichi while he can't fight back. But Hermit rescues Honoka to allow Kenichi to fight back, and that's when the First Fist shows up to stop Loki. And this is where the reveal is that the First Fist knows Kenichi. Also in the scene, Hermit resigns from Ragnarok, which is important for later. But now the plot has shifted from defending from Ragnarok to taking the fight to them, and taking the initiative, Kenichi takes down the Seventh Fist, Thor, which leads him to leaving Ragnarok and getting a farewell beating. A scene in which Kisara seems to be doubting her allegiance to Ragnarok. This leads to Kisara and Miyu bonding over cats and her being targeted by Ragnarok as a traitor, which after Kenichi and Shigure save her, she leaves Ragnarok as well. Then we take a detour into exploring Kenichi's memories, during which they have a run-in with Odin, who, as I said before, is Kenichi's old friend Ryuto, and it starts out really fun and lighthearted, but eventually turns into a clash of their ideals, physically, where Kenichi takes a big loss due to his Seikuken technique, after which is when the Elder takes Kenichi into the mountains for special training so he can learn the Seikuken as well. But while Kenichi's gone, all hell breaks loose back in town as Nijima is recruiting the former Fists of Ragnarok to join the Shinpaku Alliance, a gang he made to supplant Ragnarok with Kenichi at the spearhead, which now consists of him, 3 randos, Takeda and Ukida, Siegfried, Kisara and her forces, and not Hermit, who was invited and declined. But while Nijima tries to bolster their forces, the Second Fist, Berserker, and the Third Fist, Freya, hunt down the members of the Shinpaku, and while Kisara manages to defeat Freya with some help from Miyu, she's still pretty banged up by the end of it. Meanwhile, Berserker proceeds to tear his way through the remaining forces of Takeda, Ukida, and Siegfried, leading to Nijima being cornered in a warehouse. Getting back to Kenichi's training, however, he is having a rough go of it. On the brink of starvation, in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, separated from the Elder, he is saved by a man who's staying up in the mountains as well, who ends up being the Great Sage Fist from earlier, who offers to train Kenichi, an offer which Kenichi declines after having seen a demonstration of his ruthless fighting earlier. Turns out he was also a former student of Ryo Zanpaku, but one who didn't agree with the more lighthearted ideals of the masters, so he left and became a great dark martial artist who was the one who trained Odin. Now resuming his rigorous training with the Elder, during a break he receives an email from Nijima which reads quite like a sincere goodbye, and it's a really great moment that causes Kenichi to head back to town. Back to Nijima, having been forced into a warehouse for safety, him and his remaining forces are surrounded by Ragnarok, and as they're driven out by fire, they run into a wall of Lokis. And just when all seems lost, who comes to save them but, that's right, Thor, also Hermit. And this sets up for the final showdown of the Shinpaku Alliance versus Ragnarok, when Kenichi drops in just in time to witness the battle between Hermit and Berserker, which is pretty great. The battle of natural talent against somebody who trains relentlessly, with Berserker losing in the end, and Kenichi berating him for not accepting defeat, which is a great character moment of Kenichi, reflecting on how hard he's had to struggle up until this point. But now after all that, the stage is finally set for the final battle of Kenichi versus Odin, and what a battle it is. This is appropriately the best fight in the series, which seems like something that would be obvious for a shonen, the culmination of the whole series, one final battle to cap off all the hard work of the characters we've been following. But this isn't really the case for a lot of shonen. I can't really think of any that fit off the top of my head, besides maybe Goku versus Piccolo Jr. at the end of original Dragon Ball, or Naruto versus Sasuke from Naruto. But in both those cases, the story is continued on afterwards, and so is Kenichi technically, but not really in the anime. I mean, there are the OVAs that were made later, but seeing as they don't have a resolution, I don't really count them towards the anime. So this fight is effectively the end of the anime. And the way it goes with Kenichi and Odin evenly matched at first, only for Odin to get the upper hand after removing his glasses, and with Kenichi as well as his friends with their backs to the wall, it seems the only thing that's left is for Kenichi to watch Ragnarok destroy his friends. And that's when Takeda, Ukida, and Siegfried show up to help out. This gives Kenichi the boost he needs to continue, as well as coming full circle with some of the first friends Kenichi made, helping to save the day. It's a really great moment, and it's moments like these that always kept Takeda and the others from being swept to the side as the power curve increased, which is another aspect of Kenichi that puts above other shonens for me. But now it's time for the fight's final act.
Now, as Kenichi's getting nowhere because Odin can predict his attacks based on his own personal rhythm,
Kenichi, in one of the coolest scenes ever, imitates his masters to defeat Odin.
You may be able to predict all my moves, but you don't know anything about my masters!
Let me introduce you to the master of all Chinese martial arts, Kensei Ma!
Or so it seems, but Odin still has one more trick remaining, and he mixes his Sei and Do Chi together to give him a power boost. Upon seeing this, however, Kenichi's resolve to beat Ryuto to save him from himself strengthens, and he ends up defeating him in the end. And then this fight is capped off with the Master saving Kenichi and the Great Sage Fist saving Odin, where he remarks that the darkness is coming, which is the only loose end left in the show, and I don't really mind it. You can read it as a vague threat, and obviously Kenichi's training would continue after the series, which is why the series ending here leaves perfect room for interpretation and resolution. And one last thing I want to touch on here is the line of Kenichi talking to the elder saying,
"It's just that I kind of wanted my friend back."
Which hits pretty hard, as Odin was the one person that Kenichi wasn't able to win over after they fought, which is a pretty powerful sentiment if you think about it, that even though you can try your best, even if you may do what's right, and even if you win at the end, sometimes you can't save everybody, and sometimes you still lose, which isn't really present in the manga as it keeps going afterwards, and I'll discuss more of that in the next video. But in the anime, you can really read this from the scene, and it is just a feeling you don't get from a lot of shonens, which is why I think this being the ending to the series really makes it perfect. But what did you guys think of the series? Make sure to let me know in the comments, as well as subscribe, and check us out on Twitch, twitch.tv/Millennium Ninja, where I'll be streaming the Japanese only Kenichi PS2 game this Saturday. You don't want to miss that and all of our other content, so make sure to give us a follow. And this is CJ from Team Millennium Ninja, headed back to the village hidden in the internet.